Pickers star Danielle Colby is bringing her unique passion of burlesque.
Hi, how are you?
I'm Danielle.
Hi,
this is
Danielle.
Lauren.
Hi, Lauren. So nice to meet you.
Some of the lovely props for the ride. The tie-doll sign is something that I particularly picked out.
I love that.
The internet went wild the very day Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe's fight crossed a point of no return. Fans grieved the end of a 40-year friendship, but almost everyone forgot the third person in their mix, Danielle Colby. For years, she barely said a word about what was really going on, but barely a year after Frank's passing, she has finally come out to say what she couldn't say to his face. What was going on between the famous trio? And whose side was Danielle on? Join us as we reveal what Danielle Colby has finally confirmed about Frank Fritz. And fans might have been right all along. From strangers to siblings. When Danielle Colby and Mike Wolfe first crossed paths at a yard sale across the street from Danielle's mother's house in LeClaire, Iowa, neither of them could have imagined that their chance encounter would eventually lead to a long-running television series watched by millions. The year was sometime in the late 1980s or early 2000s, and Danielle was eyeing a lamp that caught her eye when Mike swooped in and bought the lamp right out from under her nose. Rather than apologize, Mike simply told her that the time to buy something is when you see it, a piece of picking wisdom that could have ended their interaction then and there. Instead, Danielle found herself appreciating his sass, and from that moment on, she has described them as being pretty much inseparable. Even though their connection was never romantic, they became so close that Danielle would later joke they were life mates, and their families were so intertwined that there was simply no divorcing one another at that point. Several years before American Pickers ever aired, Mike Wolfe had launched his antique business, Antique Archaeology, in 2001, setting up shop in LeClaire, Iowa, and spending his days hunting for forgotten treasures across the Midwest. The idea for American Pickers grew out of those very adventures, with Mike becoming convinced that the world deserved to see the hidden world of picking, the characters he met along the way, and the forgotten history buried in barns and basements. But when the History Channel picked up the show, set to premiere in January 2010, Mike knew he could not handle the road and the shop simultaneously, so he turned to the person he trusted most and asked Danielle to come work for him. Danielle had resisted for quite some time, wanting to focus on her own artistic projects, but she eventually looked at the situation and realized there was simply no way Mike could do this alone. She made the decision to work for him, and that decision would shape the next decade and a half of her life, turning her from a behind-the-scenes office manager into a fan favorite on a hit television show. Frank Fritz had met Mike Wolfe during their time at Bettendorf High School in Iowa. The two shared a love for antiques and a similar approach to the picking life. So when Mike needed a picking partner for the road, Frank was the natural choice. In the show's early years, Danielle's role was largely confined to the office, managing the antique archaeology shop in LeClaire, handling leads, and keeping the business running while the two men drove across the country in their van. Off-camera, however, the three of them formed a tight unit. While Frank came across as the gruff, no-nonsense foil to Mike's energy, Danielle saw a man who was surprisingly tender beneath the surface, especially when it came to his deep and abiding love for his mother, a relationship he spoke about with an emotional openness that caught Danielle off guard in their early years together. Frank would soften entirely whenever her name came up, revealing a vulnerability that stood in stark contrast to his on-screen persona. Together, they were one family. But just how strong was their bond when it started to matter the most? The explosion. The silence was the first sign that something had gone terribly wrong. Frank Fritz made his last appearance on American Pickers in March 2020, and for a while, The official story was straightforward. He had stepped away to undergo back surgery, a serious procedure that left him with 185 stitches and 2 metal rods permanently implanted in his spine. The timeline matched what he had told producers, and given his long history of struggling with Crohn's disease, a chronic condition that had plagued him since his 20s, nobody questioned that he needed time to heal. But the months passed, and the show returned to production after the initial wave of the pandemic. Yet Frank did not. Viewers began to notice that Mike was traveling with his brother Robbie instead, and Danielle was occasionally joining the road trips to fill the gap. But there was no official explanation for Frank's absence. It would take more than a year before the truth finally came into the open, and when it did, it shattered whatever remained of the trio's private harmony. In July 2021, Frank gave an interview that revealed what he had been carrying in silence. He told the outlet that he had not spoken to Mike Wolfe in 2 full years, a stretch of time that covered not only his surgery, but also the months of painful recovery that followed. What cut him the deepest was the absence of a simple phone call. Frank made it clear that Mike knew exactly how severe his back injury was, yet no one from the show, and certainly not his longtime picking partner, had reached out to ask how he was doing. He admitted that he felt like a number rather than a friend, replaced without ceremony while he lay in a hospital bed, unable to bend over far enough to tie his own shoes. Frank did not stop there. He went further, accusing the show of tilting entirely toward Mike, to the point where he claimed he could not even demonstrate how lopsided the balance had become. He also raised the possibility that Mike was deliberately pushing him out to install his brother, Robbie, as a permanent replacement, a suspicion Frank publicly voiced for the first time. Mike responded with a public statement that he clearly intended to be gracious, calling Frank a brother and saying he would miss him while praying for good things on the next part of his journey. But Frank was not fooled by the polished language. He slammed the message as insincere, accusing someone else of writing it for Mike, and pointing out that in 10 years of working together, he could not remember Mike saying 5 genuinely nice things to him unless it was behind someone else's back. In July 2022, a little over a year after his explosive interview, Frank suffered a devastating stroke at his home in Davenport, Iowa. He was found unresponsive on the floor, and the stroke left him partially paralyzed, unable to move the right side of his body, and with his speech severely impaired. The complications from the stroke also exacerbated his long-standing Crohn's disease, creating a cascade of health crises that would define the final years of his life. The show that had made him famous had moved on without him, and the friend who had once been like a brother was nowhere to be seen until he and Danielle were ready to share the dark truth. What was really happening behind the scenes? The side nobody saw. For weeks after Frank Fritz went public with his accusations against Mike Wolfe, Danielle Colby remained completely silent, watching from the sidelines as the friendship she had witnessed for more than a decade disintegrated in full view of millions of strangers. But eventually, in early August 2021, she broke her silence in a way that revealed just how deeply the situation had wounded her. Danielle posted on Instagram that she was truly saddened by the loss of Frank on the show and incredibly sad for his struggles, adding that she had personally watched everything over the last decade. Danielle finally admitted that the Frank she knew had been replaced by someone consumed by demons she could no longer ignore. Danielle did not mince words about what she had witnessed, stating directly that Frank had caused so much pain to himself that it was hard to watch, and she expressed her genuine hope that he would receive all the help he needed to become well after years of being unwell. Just days before that heartbreaking post, Danielle had taken to Instagram to share a photograph of herself with her arm around Mike Wolfe on the road, captioning the image with the unmistakable message, that she loved getting to spend time with him and that she was proud of how he had handled the last 12 years, looking forward to many more years of rolling around this big blue marble together. That seemingly simple photograph was anything but accidental. Posted at the height of the public feud, it showed whose side she was on. 2 months later, in October 2021, Danielle appeared on the Sailor Jerry podcast and offered what many interpreted as another veiled critique of her departed co-star. She said that in the entertainment industry, ego gets so real so fast, and that there had been times when she had to check herself or ask her daughter to help her read something without the tone. She never mentioned Frank by name during that conversation, but the timing of her comments, so soon after his explosive departure and his public accusations against Mike, made it nearly impossible for listeners not to draw a connection. Frank's struggles with addiction and the resentment he carried in his heart had transformed him into someone else. But something else was going on beyond the trio's breakup. What was threatening to bring down the empire they had built? The cost of their fallout. While the world watched Frank Fritz and Mike Wolfe trade accusations through the press, a quieter and arguably more devastating battle was unfolding in courtrooms and bank ledgers, where the trio's collapse was being reduced to cold numbers on a page. Frank had walked away from American Pickers with nothing resembling a golden parachute, and in the months that followed, the financial reality of that decision began to crush him. Property records in Scott County, Iowa, revealed that he had fallen behind on the taxes for his own farmhouse, a modest debt that might have seemed trivial for a man who had spent a decade on national television but was, in fact, the first visible crack in a foundation that was about to give way completely. But it was after the stroke that the money matters got worse. In the desperate weeks that followed, Frank's loved ones had to ask an Iowa court to appoint a guardian and a conservator, effectively asking a judge to declare that Frank Fritz was no longer capable of making his own decisions. The court agreed, stripping Frank of the legal right to manage his own money, his own health care, and even his own daily existence. A close friend, Chris Davis, was appointed his guardian, responsible for where Frank lived and which doctors he saw, while a local bank was named conservator of his finances, paying his bills and watching every penny he spent. The guardianship, intended to protect Frank, quickly became its own kind of nightmare. The judge overseeing the case grew furious with both the guardian and the bank, who repeatedly failed to file required paperwork on time, risking being removed entirely for incompetence. Meanwhile, the numbers from the financial disclosures painted a portrait of slow, grinding tragedy. Frank's monthly expenses soared to nearly $28,000, with round-the-clock in-home health care consuming more than $22,000 of that amount alone. His annual income, by contrast, had withered to just $60,000, a fraction of what he had earned in his American Pickers prime. His net worth, once estimated at around $6 million on paper, has become an illusion. Nobody really knows the kind of settlement Frank received after he left the show. Danielle Colby has said almost nothing publicly about the legal battles, but she has hinted, in the careful way that someone under contract must, that agreements were signed and lines drawn that cannot be crossed without severe consequences. But when all parties finally decided to cease fire, was there anything left to rebuild? The real villain. For all the anger that Frank Fritz hurled at Mike Wolfe in that explosive 2021 interview, there came a moment when the fire inside him dimmed just enough to let something else creep in. Regret. Frank never fully regained the ability to speak clearly after the stroke, and much of what he might have wanted to say in his final years remained trapped behind a paralyzed tongue and a brain that had been rewired without his permission. But in the brief window between his public meltdown and his physical collapse, Frank offered glimpses of a man who understood, at least partially, that he had burned bridges he might have wanted to cross again. He admitted in that same interview, almost as an aside, that he missed the show and missed the people on it, though he quickly buried that admission under more accusations. He said he would consider going back if the money was right, but even as the words left his mouth, there was a sadness underneath them that had nothing to do with contracts or paychecks. Frank Fritz had spent 40 years knowing Mike Wolfe, and no amount of legal paperwork could erase the fact that he had once considered that man a brother. To lose that was a loss that Frank carried with him into the hospital bed and beyond. He never said the words, "I am sorry," in any public forum, but by the time Frank might have wanted to make amends, his body had already betrayed him. On a quiet Tuesday in September 2024, Frank Fritz passed away at a hospice facility in Iowa, surrounded by a small circle of friends who had refused to abandon him, even when the courts and the tabloids had turned his life into a public spectacle. He was 60 years old. Mike Wolfe has admitted, in interviews after Frank's death, that the opioid addiction was the real villain of the story, that he had tried to get Frank into rehabilitation, and that he had been forced to make impossible choices when the network demanded clean drug tests that Frank could not provide. But an explanation is not an apology, and Mike has never quite offered the latter, perhaps because he does not believe he owes one, or perhaps because he knows that an apology delivered after a man is dead is not really an apology at all. The single most heartbreaking moment of Mike's public reckoning came after Frank died, when he posted a photograph of the two of them on the road, smiling at something off camera. In the caption, Mike wrote that he would miss Frank, and then he said something that felt like a knife turning in a wound that had never properly healed. He wished he had called more often. At the end, none of their accusations mattered. What mattered was that two men who had once been brothers stopped calling each other, and by the time one of them wanted to pick up the phone, the other was no longer able to answer. And when words were no longer possible, what did Danielle do when she heard Frank was gone? Rest in peace, road dog. The moment the news broke that Frank Fritz had passed away, Danielle Colby did what she has always done when words felt insufficient. She posted a photograph of three of them from the early years, writing that she would miss his ability to make everyone laugh, his love for talking tattoos, and his epic collections. But most of all, those little glimpses of vulnerability he showed from time to time. She called him a road dog and signed off with "Rest in peace." There was no trace of the frustration that had marked some of her comments during the feud years, just a woman mourning a friend. But just as Frank's passing neared its one-year mark, Danielle sat down with Newsweek and spoke more directly about the loss. She said everyone missed Frank, especially his laughter and his sharp, witty personality, which had kept the trio together through all those years of filming. But what she missed most were the rare moments when Frank let his guard down completely, when he would hug her without prompting or call up just to ask questions or seek advice. That admission that Frank's humor was what kept them together was an indirect way of saying that the show had not been the same without him. Danielle has never said that outright because she remains loyal to the job and to Mike. But the numbers tell the story. When Frank was on American Pickers, episodes regularly drew over 1 million viewers, with the series premiere pulling in 3.1 million. After his departure in 2021, ratings began to slide. By season 26, filmed and aired after his death, ratings had sunk to a season low of 442,000, the lowest the show has seen since its early days. Fans have been blunt on social media, calling the show boring without Frank, describing his replacement, Robbie, as like watching paint dry, and complaining that episodes feel staged and hollow. The show continues because television does not stop for grief. But Danielle's words make it clear that some absences cannot be filled, and the best anyone can do is keep moving while carrying the people they have lost. Now that the truth is out, do you believe American Pickers should have ended when Frank left? Or was Mike right to keep the show going? Share your thoughts with us in the comments section. Remember to like, share, and subscribe for more. Also, click the next video showing on your screen. You will enjoy it.